welcome to Sweet to Neat, our bourbon journey. I'm at the Bourbon Bookshelf today without my queen of everything, Peggy, because she's off working on her bakery business this evening, but we wanted to continue our educational efforts. Hopefully we piqued your interest with our introductory video about why you would want to think about drinking bourbon neat, and I thought we would discuss what is whiskey. Whiskey is a mashed grain that has been fermented with yeast, and that mash is distilled, and the distillate is aged in wooden barrels typically. I'm going to break that down a little bit more. A mashed grain is what it sounds like. They take a mixture of different grains typically, mash them together, and then they take that mash and ferment it with yeast to create alcohol. That mixture is then distilled or heated so that the alcohol evaporates, and the distillate is passed through various tubes to cool it, and the liquid is then recollected and put into barrels to age. The mash bill is the breakdown of the grains that are used, and typical grains are corn, rye, barley, and wheat. Bourbon is, by law, at least 51% corn, and it has to be aged in new charred oak barrels in order to be bourbon. There is no legal age requirement on bourbon, but if it's a straight bourbon, it has to be aged for at least 2 years, and if it's aged less than 4 years, it has to say so on the bottle. A bottled in bond bourbon has to be aged at least 4 years. These are some typical examples you'll see of bourbon that pretty much everyone has seen. Another category of bourbon that is a little controversial is Tennessee whiskey. Tennessee whiskey meets all the definitions of bourbon, but it has to be made particularly in Tennessee. To be bourbon, it just has to be made somewhere in the United States. It doesn't have to be made in Kentucky. It has to be made in one of the 50 states or territories. But to be Tennessee whiskey, it has to be in Tennessee, and it has to go through the Lincoln process, in which it's filtered through maple charcoal prior to going into the barrel. Many people will argue that it's not bourbon, but Tennessee whiskey, again, technically meets the definition of whiskey. Bourbons are typically then further characterized by their mash bill. You can have high rye bourbons where the secondary grain is predominantly rye. Wheated bourbons, you would think they would be called high wheat bourbons since it's a high rye bourbon if it's high in rye, but wheated bourbons are high in wheat. There are high corn bourbons where the mash bill is at least 80% corn, such as Jack Daniel's common mash bill. And there are a few high malt whiskeys. Malted barley is a barley that has been allowed to start to germinate, and that opens up the seeds and releases some of the sugars. So it typically gives a more sweet and mellow flavor. There are a few ryes and whiskeys that have malted rye. And that leads into other types of whiskey. A common whiskey, and actually the first American whiskey, is rye. Rye has to be at least 51% rye grains used in the mash bill. Wheat whiskeys usually use at least 51% wheat in the mash bill. Corn whiskeys, there are not a lot of them. There are some Texas distilleries doing corn whiskeys, but mellow corn is the classic standard for a corn whiskey. And then you have malt whiskeys. This is where American whiskey starts to get into the territory of Scotch. This is a blended malt. I don't have a single malt American whiskey, but that is a growing category. Moving out of the United States, Irish whiskey is a very commonly imported whiskey. Irish whiskey is a malted whiskey or malted barley, and it is typically triple distilled. Most whiskeys are only distilled once or twice, but Irish whiskeys are typically triple distilled, and because they use malted barley, they're often a more mellow and less intense flavor, and often a great starting point for someone new to the world of whiskey to find out if they are interested in whiskey. Canadian whiskey often uses all the same grains as bourbon, but Canadian whiskey does not have to be aged in new oak barrels, and it does not have to avoid using colorings or flavorings. Bourbon cannot have colorings or flavorings to be called a bourbon. This probably is not Canadian whiskey with much coloring, but a common Canadian whiskey that does add flavorings is Crown Royal. Scotch is a big category of whiskeys from outside the United States. Scotch has to be distilled and aged in Scotland and is typically high in malted barley, but you can have single malt whiskey or scotches and blended scotches. Sorry, had a little brain freeze there. Scotch is further broken down typically into whether it is peated or non-peated, and that often falls based on the territory in Scotland that it comes from. Peated scotches are distilled over burning peat, and that imparts a very smoky flavor often to the scotch. Japanese whiskey falls very much into the same style as Scotch, and again there are blended Japanese whiskeys. And then this is a single malt whiskey. This actually happens to be a Taiwanese single malt. That's just a quick overview of the different types of whiskeys that are out there. We will, of course, be going into all of the different types of whiskeys further, and especially focusing on bourbon. That's our love. But we wanted to share that with you and help you to, again, get to a little bit of understanding of all the different varieties when you get to the liquor store. I wanted to quickly highlight the Freedom 250 release from our local distillery, the St. Petersburg Distillery. We were lucky enough today to get bottle 250, so I wanted to display that, and I'm drinking its sister bottle 49. A delicious whiskey. If you're in the Tampa area, I strongly recommend you get a bottle while they're still out there. Remember, the way you enjoy your whiskey is the right way to enjoy whiskey. And cheers from sweet to neat.